Recording started.
So we pick up today in the 20th century, predominantly focusing on the churches of Christ. We have a few things to finish up with respect to the premillennialism controversy that arose in the early part of the 20th century, but by the end of World War II has largely been finished. There are still a few, relatively few churches of Christ, predominantly in Kentucky, that are premillennial, but most churches of Christ do not evidence that approach to the end times. Certainly there are probably more people today who might be premillennial and not really realize that if they have accepted some of the ideas presented in books like Left Behind, some other apocalyptic types of movies. So there might be some people that are still influenced by that because of the presence in both regular popular culture as well as Christian popular culture, who probably wouldn't identify themselves as premillennial because they don't necessarily think of that as a know what premillennialism is. Most churches of Christ, however, most Christians in churches of Christ would not necessarily fit into that model. Where we finished up in the week before spring break was looking at the major source of conflict, and largely due to the teachings of a man named Archbold. Now remember, premillennialism had been a viewpoint that several people in the 19th century in the Restoration movement had. Most were postmillennialists, but there were some that were premillennialists, some very prominent ones like Barton W. Stone, Walter Scott for a time, a lot of people who had been shaped by William Miller and his views on and his kind of calculations on the end times. So it had been something that had been present, something that was influential in the 19th century, although postmillennialism was largely the major view of a lot of people in the Restoration movement, and even through the split. But largely there is this controversy that develops in the 20th century over this issue that had not been a major issue before. Certainly people had kind of expressed their ideas on this, had called into question the other views of different people on this subject. So there was some dialogue on it, but there is a level that develops in the 20th century among the churches of Christ where there is a rather combative approach to this that had not necessarily existed prior to this point, and a concerted effort to either convince people that premillennialism was not biblical, or an attempt to try and mark those individuals who were premillennialists, preachers that were sharing that idea, in an attempt to either silence them or marginalize them. Something that wasn't as much of a prevalent idea in the 19th century. And I think largely because there were other theological issues that we were looking at, that we've looked at, that took a lot of the focus. So, and I think also because it had become such a major part of fundamentalism in the 20th century, so it was becoming a major issue in the larger American Protestant culture, that it was kind of something that was in discussion in the broad Christian groups that existed at the time. So anyway, Archbold becomes really the focal point of all this because he becomes one of the prime spokespeople for it. active in writing in the journal Word and Work, had been active writing in the Gospel Advocate, but there's an effort to remove him from being one of the editors of Gospel Advocate, and he ends up writing for Word and Work. Having a variety of debates on this subject, we talked about the debate with H. Leo Bowles, and how, one of the things that for Bowles and others who are becoming opposed to the premillennialist view is how the church is viewed in that scheme. Often, a lot of people who took the premillennialist view looked at the ministry of Jesus, or at least stereotypically looked at the ministry of Jesus, as somewhat unsuccessful in certain aspects. Certainly, the death on the cross was vitally important, fulfilled prophecy. It was, of course, very important for salvation of human beings. So there's that aspect of it. But the claim also was by a lot of premillennialists, especially as you move through the 20th century, that the church wasn't Jesus' original intent. That it is a measure that is put into place because the Jews did not accept him as Messiah. And so the idea becomes that the kingdom was something that still needed to be established because it had been prophesied in the Old Testament, and so there was still this need to fulfill these prophecies. So in thinking about this, a lot of people in the churches of Christ, beginning in the 20th century especially, often made a very close connection with the kingdom and the church, and appeal to a variety of passages to say that when Jesus established his church, Jesus was establishing his kingdom. And I think that in many respects there's a lot of good scriptural passages that support that. Certainly I think that often the explicit connection between church and kingdom overlooks the fact that there are some elements of the kingdom that are still waiting to be fulfilled, but not in the sense of an earthly kingdom, as a lot of millennialists saw it. So for a lot of the people within the more mainstream of churches of Christ, the church and the kingdom were the same. So there wasn't any unfulfilled prophecy where Jesus was going to have to come back and rule on earth in a kingdom. So when Archbold is preaching these premillennialist outlook, for a lot of mainstream Christians, it's looked upon as a lot of mainstream Christians in churches of Christ, I should say. It's looked at as saying that the church was not fulfilling the mission that Jesus had established for it. And so there was a lot of concern about this. So in between the two world wars, there is this concerted effort to try and eliminate premillennialist teaching from within the churches of Christ. And so a lot of editors, preachers were very active in identifying not only teachers like Bowl and journals like Word and Work, but were even concerned about the presence of premillennialism at the colleges. And so, it became a matter of which colleges are faithful and which colleges are teaching premillennialism. So Harding, for a while, James Harding, who the school is named after, had been a premillennialist. And so there was concern that Harding was premillennialist, especially the president of Harding at the time, in the early 20th century. He denied it. But what further hurt Harding was, as these efforts are going about to condemn R.H. Bowles' work and condemn his teachings, the president of Harding refuses to do that. when a lot of other presidents of these various colleges and churches of Christ are willing to stand up and condemn his teaching and to refute it and those kind of things. And so that further hurt Harding's reputation a little bit because the president at the time didn't join with these other presidents. One of the major individuals involved in this controversy, as far as the opponents of premillennialism, was a man named Floyd E. Wallace, Jr. Wallace was born in Texas, often referred to as Floyd E. Wallace, Jr., but actually he had a different middle name than his father did. Usually, it's having the same middle name is a part of that, but Floyd E. Wallace, Jr. Was a son of a different Floyd E. Wallace. And very early on, Wallace decides to become an evangelist, and he's holding gospel meetings, preaching as early as 15, and is very successful at it, gaining a lot of converts and encouraging a lot of people to be baptized. And so he's kind of this boy wonder when it comes to preaching. He would eventually become editor of the Gospel Advocate. Later he would start other journals as well. In fact, one of his journals was formed just to attack premillennialism. That was kind of the main reason for that journal. So ultimately he becomes the main force in trying to rid churches of Christ of premillennialism. And so when it comes down to it, there are basically three issues that become very important for Wallace. Premillennialism, as well as which he's against, the Christian's responsibility to civil government, which he is very for, just kind of patriotic, active involvement in governmental response to government. Yes, that Christians have a civic responsibility to be voting and to be supporting the government, those kind of things. And then, and finally, his other main issue during his life was church support for colleges. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit, which he was against. So he's against premillennialism, against church support for colleges, but supportive of Christians being patriotic, being very supportive of government, which is a slight bit of a change here for churches of Christ. As we noted, when the Restoration movement begins to split, there's a very heavy influence in churches of Christ from the stream of thought of Barton W. Stone, David Lipscomb, and others who had kind of maintained a position of separatism from public life, government, those kind of things. And you see that a lot in Lipscomb's On Civil Government, which, again, kind of remind you that that essay on Lipscomb's civil government is due in a couple of weeks. So don't make sure to be reading and working on that. But Wallace, kind of grows up very early on, has those kind of views, has pacifist type of views, but it appears that the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 by Japanese aircraft really changes Wallace's view, so that he becomes very patriotic, very supportive of Christians being involved in government, those kind of things. Ultimately, there were some people, of course, that were very concerned about Wallace's attack on Bull, feeling that he was too harsh. They felt that he was, overly combative. But the way he sees Bull is he's kind of breaking off and starting a new group. And he's also, according to Wallace, teaching heresy about the Holy Spirit. So there's a lot of concern that he has, and there's this mentality that is present in a lot of churches of Christ in Texas in the early 20th century of what some people refer to as the fighting style. And that it's not just a matter of trying to persuade people, it's you're very active, militant in trying to suppress what appears to be heresy. And so Wallace becomes one of the main forces in the opposition to premillennialism, and is, in many respects, very successful. So that by the end of World War II, premillennialism has largely been eliminated from churches of Christ, except for, as I mentioned at the beginning, some churches predominantly around and in Kentucky. There isn't a widespread premillennialist view. Most people in churches of Christ tend to be what we might call amillennial, in the sense that the millennium of Revelation chapter 20 is figurative and does not represent a literal reign of Christ on earth for 1,000 years. And certainly you'll find different views even within the amillennial view, but essentially this is the idea, is that the millennium is just more of a figurative or symbolic thing in Revelation, and not a time to look forward to at the end of time where Jesus is going to set up a kingdom on earth. So most people in churches of Christ today tend to be that way, and I think largely that is due to how effectively Wallace and others had minimalized premillennialism. Now, I also believe that there are good scriptural reasons to be amillennial as well. There's problems with premillennialism and its interpretation of Scripture. There's problems with postmillennialism and its interpretation of Scripture as well, especially Revelation. But I think as well that it doesn't gain a hold in churches of Christ because of how active people were in trying to suppress it or prevent it from spread.